In this session, we're going to talk about a step-by-step guide to creating your outline. So you will have the opportunity to practice this skill in this course, but what I want to do here is just literally go through a step-by-step guide before you try to put this into practice on your own. If you follow these steps, this is how you create your outlines. This is the actual process of doing it in the most efficient manner possible. And while we go through these steps, I'll tell you some of the common mistakes that I see students make when creating their outlines. So first you want to gather your materials together, make sure that you have your syllabus, your class notes, your casebook, any supplements that you've been using, and also your laptop and a big cup of coffee. All right, outlining is hard work. It's not easy. It requires you to internalize a lot and organize a lot and delete from your class notes. So you want to be nice and caffeinated when you do this. So first, let's start by talking about the first step. And this might sound obvious, but a lot of students forget this step. And that is to look at your syllabus. Your syllabus is your bird's eye view of that class for the semester. So for example, if you talk about contract formation and then defenses and then the statute of frauds and then remedies, you can see over the course of a semester in contracts exactly what you'll be covering. Some people, even if they want to start creating the skeleton of their outline early on, they will literally just take their syllabus and chop it up into these different sections and put it in a Word doc, and they've already started their outline. So that's one thing that you can do. But always consult your syllabus because this will give you a bird's eye view of the class, and this will really create the backbone of your whole outline. Next, start with the first issue. For example, offer, and find the rules that go with each issue. The best resource for rules are your class notes. Because again, remember, your professor writes the exam, your professor grades the exam, so you want to say the rules that your professor says in class. Sometimes your professor might not say the rule. In that case, you might have to look at your casebook, you might have to look at a supplement, you might have to Google it, try to figure out what the rule is. But you need the black letter law to go in your outline. Your whole outline will be organized around the rules of law. Some people make the mistake of organizing their whole outline around cases, which is a huge mistake. Cases just illustrate the law. So start by organizing your outline around the rules of law. That's the most important thing. And again, your class notes are your absolute best resource, but if you don't have it in your class notes, then a supplement or your casebook would be your second best resource. Okay, so you write out the rule. Let's look at an example of this. It says contract formation offer. Rule is an offer is a manifestation of intent to enter into a contract, and the elements are an offer requires both intent and specific terms. The specific terms are price, quantity, and identity of the offeree. It also requires intent from the perspective of a reasonable person. Okay, so the problem with this is that it's hard to learn. It's going to be hard to memorize just sentences like that. So your job in creating an outline is to make it easy for your brain to memorize. So part 3 is to break down the rule into manageable parts. So let's take a look at this. Rather than having one long sentence on what an offer is, break it down into its components. So it still says the rule, an offer is a manifestation of intent to enter into a contract, but then there's elements. An offer requires both intent and specific terms. And you can see price, quantity, and identity of the offeree. Isn't it much easier to review something like this in bullet form than it is just to memorize one long sentence? Okay, you should probably find it much easier. Some people also find it really helpful to color code the rules. They'll put the rules in blue or something like that so that they stand out more, or they'll do something specific to the elements, like underline them. Do whatever works best for you, and you'll figure it out as the semester goes along. But the important thing is that you've broken it down into a way that's easy for you to learn. Next, add cases or at least rules from cases. So if you take our advice and you outline early, you'll have plenty of time to incorporate cases into your outline. If you are starting at the very end of the semester and you do not take our advice, or you're starting during study period, and trust me, you won't be alone, then do not do this, okay? Don't incorporate cases if you start late. This is something you should do if you start early. I found it helpful to incorporate just a sentence from every case, and I would put the case name in my outline, and I was a little bit neurotic. I would actually memorize the case name that went with the rule. And the reason I did this was because I was starting to create and memorize my outlines from week 1, so I had plenty of time to do it. And the second reason I did it was because I thought it would impress my professor, particularly on my closed book exams, if I could literally recite case names by different principles of law. And I really was very competitive and I wanted to get that A+ in every class. And I did. I got A+ in over half of my law school classes. And it was because of little things like this, okay? Like I would go the extra step and make sure that I memorized the case name that went with the rule. Again, if you're starting late, do not do this. It's not worth your time. You can get an A or even an A+ in law school with citing no cases in most of your classes. So that's how unimportant cases are in comparison with the black letter law. So keep that in mind. Okay, when you do write cases in your outline, if you do incorporate them, don't write a case brief and put it in your outline. Please don't do that. That will waste up so much space. Instead, you want to try to summarize every single case in just a sentence or two. Don't focus a ton on the facts. Just put whatever the applicable facts are and the holding or whatever, make it as short as possible, like we did in this example here. You can see that these are just summarized in a couple sentences. They're really short and brief. You could just quickly look at them and see what was tested. Another thing is if you don't want to incorporate every case that's assigned, which I don't recommend, instead incorporate the cases that you talk about in class. So if you spend 30 minutes talking about a case in your contracts class, that's probably important enough to incorporate into your outline, even if it's just a sentence or two. If you don't spend any time, or you spend 5 minutes talking about 10 cases really quickly, I wouldn't incorporate any of those in the outline. That tells me that the professor doesn't think they're that important if they're spending so little time on them. So really focus on the cases that your professor spends time talking about. This goes back to that principle that your professor is the one that writes and grades your exam, so you have to focus on what they focus on. So that might even help you pare down the number of cases in your outline. Maybe you'll just have a case or two for every class that you attend. Okay, next, use hypothetical examples or important points your professor made in class to illustrate a rule. This is something that I think is important, and a lot of students, I noticed when I was in law school, as soon as the professor would start asking hypos, they'd stop typing or they'd put down their pen or whatever. And this is really when you should be typing, because your professor is telling you kind of how they're going to test the law on your exam. So they're going to change the facts in one way, and they're going to ask a student a question who's on call, and that student's going to try to answer the question. Well, type in your class notes the hypothetical question that they ask, and then whatever the correct answer is. So put that in your class notes, because if it's a good hypo, you might want to incorporate it in your outlines as a way to actively review and kind of quiz yourself as you're memorizing your outline. And then lastly, identify and draw attention to the minority rules, exceptions to the rules, and the parts of the law that are unsettled. Some people really feel uncomfortable when there are two different rules. Like they'll say, these rules contradict each other. There's a minority approach that says this, but the majority says this. Or common law says this and the restatement says this. And that makes them uncomfortable, so they try to avoid that section. But that's actually prime substantive law for testing. Professors are going to give you fact patterns that could go either way and require arguments and analysis. So it's very easy for them to create a good law school exam question by testing on a part of the law that's not settled, or testing on a part of the law where there's a minority rule and a majority rule. So you don't want to avoid these. Instead, you want to embrace these areas of uncertainty. And just know that's okay, that there's two different rules that govern something, and they might lead to opposite outcomes, and that's okay. That's all, the way the law works. And that's prime material for testing. So that's a step-by-step guide to creating your outlines. You're going to have the opportunity next to try to create a little criminal outline from your class notes, and this will give you a feel for how to outline, what to include in your outline, and just the skill of outlining. And remember, you're not going to feel great about it in the beginning. You're going to feel a little bit unsettled probably, and that's how you might feel at the whole beginning of your law school semester or your whole first semester. You might not ever feel great about it, but that's okay. Remember, you don't have to feel confident about it, and your outline doesn't have to be great. What's more important is that you outline right from the beginning of the semester and that you learn your outlines. And we'll be talking about how to learn and memorize your outlines next.